Hello, young ladies and young gentlemen. This is the second of two videos to explain to beginners what are arrays. After learning about values that are numbers and strings, you then learn about values that are arrays. This is an array. It contains the values inside. Inside it contains 108. So an array has values inside. In this case, 108. You look up each value with an index to get access to the value. The index you use to get access to the value is 0, 1, 2. You begin with 0. You don't begin with 1. That's a common mistake. So A0 is 1. A1 is here, and A2 is 8. Now notice that with an array, the values are sorted in a linear sequence that you can go through in order. This is the first, this is the last, it's a particular order. That's always the case with arrays. Later you will run across complex data structures that are not arrays, where you don't have that sorting order. But that's an issue for another day. Now let's modify what's inside an array. These are assignment statements. A1 equal to red. That means assign to A1 red and assign to A0 77. So after you do this, look at what happens. The array becomes this. And after you do this, the array becomes this. So at this slot, at slot 1, this is 0, 1, 2. Slot 0, slot 1, slot 2. At slot 1, you change the value to red. At slot 0, you change the value to 77. You put a value into an array, and to get access to that value, you use an integer index, 0, 1, 2. Which integer is valid depends on how big the array is. In this case, the array is big enough for 3 elements inside, 3 values inside. Without the right index, you do not have access to find the value that you're looking for. Now, for beginner students, I'd like to move on to a bit of a subtle point that I think you need to deal with as beginner students to help with your intuition. So pay close attention. In teaching about arrays or other complex data structures, it is helpful to visualize it as a jar or a box, as some kind of container, and that can be helpful. In time, you will see that choice of words, the choice of words container or jar or box, something that you put other values inside, it's helpful in understanding how to work with them and working with them. But in time you will see it is not 100% precise in terms of what is actually happening. So at some point you need to understand where the word container or box is a little bit imprecise, even if it is helpful. So, think of these. This is a value that's a container. This is another value that is a container, right? A container, you can put other values inside, right? So I put these values inside this container. Okay, here's where the language gets a little bit off in terms of teaching you what is precisely happening on the memory chip. If I have a value that's inside this container, then you can see that it cannot be inside this container. You cannot have a value that's inside simultaneously both of these containers. It can be in here or in here, but not both at once, which is not quite in sync with what is actually happening on the computer's memory chip. So at some point, before you begin your instruction as a beginner student, you have to understand why the word container is a little bit not 100% accurate. Okay? So that's a subtle distinction that I'd like to explain early on. I prefer not to wait until you're an intermediate level student. I want to clarify this. So remember, legally speaking, an array is not a container. It is not a box. But it's useful intuitively early on when you're learning to think of an array as a container. And there are things that you put inside the container. But legally speaking, that is not exactly what's happening. So I'm going to have to explain what I mean. Be patient here while I put new information on the whiteboard. Okay, so here's why the word container is slightly not technically precise. In array, what the truth is, what's actually happening is that an array contains pieces of information. So an array contains inside pieces of information. Each piece of information inside the array is like a pointer. It points to the location on the memory chip where the value that is useful is stored on the memory chip. So this array here has 3 pieces of information inside. And actually what is inside, this is a pointer that points to the location this corresponds to. We think of this array here intuitively as 108. Okay? So we think of this array as the array that has values 108 inside. What is actually happening, folks, is when you think of an array that has 108 as values inside, what is actually happening is inside the array are 3 pieces of information. Here is a piece of information that points to the location on the memory chip where the value 1 is. This piece of information is a pointer to the value 0. And this piece of information, as you can guess, points to the location on the memory chip where the value 8 is stored, and we usually visualize it in our head as this. Okay? And that's, so technically, the values 108, they're not really inside the array. We think of the values 108 as being inside the array. The array is like a box or a container. But the truth is, the array contains information that gives us access to these values wherever those values are stored on the memory chip. Sometimes that subtle distinction is important, though it's probably not important with examples you'll exercise with in your first 3 or 4 weeks. Okay, now consider this other example. Object 1. Object 1, I put inside both the array A and B. Object 1 is not a number or string. Object 1 is a big, complicated value that has many things inside it. And object 1 is a big, complicated value that is stored at some location on the memory chip. What kind of big complicated thing this is does not matter. Just understand it's a big thing on the memory chip with lots of stuff inside it, and it's got a location on the memory chip. Okay? So, what this means, when I do this, what this means is inside this array is a pointer to the location on the memory chip where object 1 is stored. And then here's another array, the array B, and I have another pointer but to the same location on the memory chip, the same copy. The same value, the same copy of the value, because it's the same location on the memory chip. So inside the array B, I have a pointer that points to the same location on the memory chip, the same value, object 1, and the same copy of that value. It's not it's not a second copy of the value that's put somewhere else in the memory chip. So the array A and the array B both refer to the same copy of the same value at the same location on the memory chip. So technically speaking, you cannot really think precisely that say that object 1 is inside the array A. That's not exactly true. And object 1 is technically speaking not inside array B either. Rather, array A has a reference that gives us access to object 1, to where object 1 is, and the same for array B. And I hope that that explanation is successful at explaining why the word container or box is intuitively helpful, especially for beginner students, but you have to know where that use of language can be a tiny bit misleading. And if you understand that, then you have a better understanding of how arrays and other complex data structures actually work. Arrays, along with other complex data structures, contain inside little tiny pieces of information, and each tiny piece of information is not the value itself. Rather, it points to the location on the memory chip where the value that you care about is. Okay? So, if you understand that, then you won't be confused by over-interpreting to an extreme the use of the word container or box. And I think that about does it. This is the second of 2 videos to explain what an array is. And by the way, a hash is a data structure that's very similar to an array, but a little bit different. And we'll talk about what hashes are at a different lecture. Thank you. Young ladies and young gentlemen, that concludes this lecture.